It's a great delight to be here at Wheaton. I know and admire many Wheaton alums, and many years ago, in fact, in another millennium, I used to attend this campus regularly for your philosophy conferences back in the mid-1990s. Apart from the excellence of the conversation of those conferences, the other thing I remember is that you had a completely awesome dining hall. It was like a large log cabin or something. It looked like the kind of prototype for all Caribou coffees. It was pretty cool, and for someone used to the south side of Chicago, where we don't actually have many buildings with roofs and stuff, it was amazing. So I've always looked on this place with a degree of intellectual respect and financial awe. It's also a delight and equally a challenge to take up the topic that I'm speaking about tonight, freedom and responsibility for Christian citizens. Recent, past, and current events call out for interpretations that are both politically and theologically astute and profound. For example, when I began teaching almost 20 years ago, soon after those conferences and that excellent dining hall, I would never have imagined that the United States Marine Corps would spend a good part of the last decade occupying a base built around the ruins of ancient Babylon. But that's just what they did. I certainly never imagined that the adjunct law professor whom I occasionally would see in the Hyde Park Co-op, the guy with the funny name, would end up being the president of the United States. And even if I had imagined that, I would not have imagined what he himself said just before the 2012 election, at least as reported in the a couple of articles I've seen. The one thing I'm very, very good at is killing people. Right? Interesting thought. As time goes on, the ironies of history are hardly dissipating. If anything, they are mounting. This is perhaps especially pointed for us on this day, as Professor Baycoat said, November 11th, here in America, called Veterans Day. 95 years ago, it was November 11th, 1918, the end of World War I. I spent last year in the United Kingdom, and I had two politically very influential experiences there for me. One was watching the United States election from another country. There were many days when the news from the United States led the news in Great Britain, which is a fascinating thought. Great Britain is actually quite an interesting and lively political culture, and as things go, a really, really important one. And yet, left, right, and center, all the media, BBC on, everybody was gripped by the American election. And let's admit that the 2012 election was not very gripping. I mean, you have two people whose genetics are designed to be boring in a certain way, fighting it out. There's no Sarah Palin, Joe Biden's there, but they put him in a closet, and they heavily doped him up. And, Paul Ryan is not very exciting himself either, so we don't have much in the way of excitement. But it was completely gripping. And that instructed me very profoundly in the enormous weight and implications that each of you have in a way that almost everybody else in the world doesn't have, simply by your ability to vote here in the United States. That is a sobering, and it should be, remarkable and remarked upon thought. I know you guys are far more intellectually responsible than many of my own students, but when I think about the people I met at Oxford and Cambridge who were affected profoundly by things in our world and who had no actual say in what happens, and then I think about some of my students, I tremble at the thought, as Mr. Jefferson said, that God is just. The other politically formative event that happened for me last year was simply by absorbing the experience of the United Kingdom, a place that was incredibly, indelibly, and tragically marked by the First World War, by the event that actually we mark on Armistice Day, what they call Remembrance Day, what we call Veterans Day. In 1914, when that war began, Great Britain was an empire the likes of which the world had never known. It was an empire of commerce, an empire governed by commitment to liberty, a rule of law, an empire that understood itself and had a good cause, a good reason to understand itself as governed by and committed to standards of decency that no empire before it had ever inhabited. Sound familiar? It might. And it was, for me, an enormously sobering thought be in a context where, at least in some sense, I saw the consequences of living in the aftermath of an empire, especially since we seem to be living in one, for good and ill, now. Okay. That's the framework within which I approach the question I want to talk about tonight. How should Christians, especially in our culture, in this country, understand their political responsibilities in light of their fundamental vocation to be citizens of the kingdom of God? This is not a new question, right? In the past century, the age of great secular ideologies, we saw a fair amount of phenomena crying out for simultaneously political and theological interpretation. And the churches were given the theologians that were fit or were thought to be fit for that task. In an age of the great power of nation-states, we saw thinkers like Reinhold Niebuhr and Karl Barth explore the theological possibilities and perils of an age in which nationalism and power politics, international and domestic, were the main drivers of political action. There is then some history we can draw on in our reflections in this century, but we must use that history wisely. For I think we are entering an importantly new era, an era in which a too exclusive focus on these political phenomena will miseducate us about the full range of challenges we face and what it means, after all, to face them. Providentially, perhaps, that is the most theologically dubious thing I will say all night, the past decade has seen a new kind of political theology emerge, one that is attempting, though not fully consciously, to overcome the too exclusive focus on the nation-state. I aim tonight to get you to see what I mean, and I hope to convince you that I'm right. I want to make this effort in 3 large steps. First, I want to try to locate this new political theology in the larger context of Christian freedom, what it is and what it is for. I'll try to explain how I think Christians should live as responsible citizens in a free society, in particular our own, and in particular, how Christians should think about exercising their political freedom and responsibility and witnessing for others to exercise their political freedom and responsibility as well as part of their larger pedagogy of Christian discipleship. Then, after laying that out, that's the meat of what I want to do. Second and third, I want to briefly suggest that with this account in view, we can better appreciate 2 distinct sorts of challenges that we face today. Challenges we will increasingly feel in the foreseeable future. Challenges that I call the threat of an enervating, joyless consumerism on the one hand, and the challenge of a hyperventilating moral imperative on the other. Doing all this in 45 minutes will be a tall order, so let me get right at it. Let me begin by contextualizing very telegraphically the question that I want to talk about Christian citizenship within our broader reflection on vocation, our vocation as children and friends of God. Because Christian freedom, after all, is a far broader context than political liberty, and it should not be confused with it. As Christians, we are free, and our vocation for which we are free is to participate joyfully in the already consummated, but for us only eschatologically realized, loving, perichoretic round of the triune God. We are free, that is, to be God's friends as well as God's children. God has called us to this freedom. Some take this so far as to talk about divinization or deification for Christians, for humans. I admit that I am one of those. We are called to a destiny, and I hope and I pray that one day we will all come to know that joy. Of course, this freedom has a concomitant responsibility as well. We're obligated to become fit to bear the weight of glory that is this eschatological destiny. Our lives in this light are a training, an exercise, as Augustine would put it, in the virtues which will become in the eschaton our second nature. Our responsibility as individuals before God, fellow members of the body of Christ on pilgrimage during the world, and simply as creatures under God's providential creation, is gracefully to accept this vocation and receive God's tutelage in our lives, wherever that tutelage may be found. It may certainly be found in politics and in public life. That task of responsibility, that burden of responsibility, is encountered and addressed differently in different settings. In this text, in this talk, I want to explore how it may be met in public life, in the context of our politics. Now, I have a broad construal of what politics means here. I don't want this to be too narrow. Right now, in and around Washington, D.C., there's a lively debate about the name of the football team, the Washington Redskins, that's going on. It's a pretty political debate, actually, and in all sorts of interesting ways. It touches on a whole range of dimensions about what sports teams mean for people, how the team can mean multiple things. It's a richly and complicated debate, and I think it's a fairly political debate, right? So you hear people talk about that ESPN is not a political channel. It is, in some important ways, a political channel. That's all right. Our food can be political. I have not lately checked the Wheaton dining hall, but if you're anything like UVA's dining halls, there are dimensions of issues around where you get your food from, what kind of food is organic, what kind of food isn't organic. Do you have anything about local food, anything like that? Well, okay, there you go, right? This is all deeply political. Our food is political. When did that happen? Like, sometime between when I was in college and now, right? Because let me tell you, as long as it was dead, we were eating it. Sometimes not even that, but we won't go there. Of course, not everything is political, right? I'm not trying to say that, but a great deal can be. All deliberations, debates, and discussions about how best to organize our common life we could broadly construe as political, as part of our public life. Now, there can be multiple kinds of politics, that is, because we are citizens of multiple kinds of we's, right? We're citizens of families, churches, colleges, towns, states, nations, the world. I recognize the dangers of overbloating on politics, but I do think that in some important ways the personal can be political. Now, there's been a long-standing debate about how particular citizens with particular commitments should operate in a pluralistic public setting such as the USA. It's a good and rich and powerful and interesting debate. And you should all take as many courses as possible in studying that debate. That's a worthwhile one that will continue to be lively for the rest of our lives. I and many of the faculty in this room and elsewhere at Wheaton have participated and contributed to that debate in our own work. But this talk is not centrally an extension of that debate. It's an attempt to inflect it, to modify it in some important ways. But to help you understand something of where I'm coming from, let me rehearse quickly the steps that the debate has taken up to the present. Okay? So for a long time, conversations in religion and politics were divided in theological circles and to some degree in political philosophical circles, although a more complicated story there. Divided between what we can call liberal translationists and communitarian incommensurabilists. Okay? I'll tell you what this means. Translationists conceived the public sphere as a place where the crucial political categories had to be apprehensible to all, as a kind of Venn diagram. This could include thinkers in the Roman natural law tradition, Roman Catholic natural law tradition, Protestant Christian realists, and others. Religious voices were distinctive, if they were distinctive, in their motivating energies, in their energy to contribute to the debate, not in what they contributed conceptually to the discussion. In contrast, or in recoil, perhaps, incommensurabilists reacted against this and insisting on the distinctiveness not just of Christian motive, but of Christian concepts, and demanding that those concepts be given full credit in the debate and not be translated into any others. Now, there were flickers of other ways going on. This debate lasted basically from the 60s up until the 2000s. Other thinkers tried to offer routes out of this stalemate. But effectively, there was a stalemate. The translationists would not let go of the idea that a contribution had to be a contribution that others would acknowledge as a contribution. And incommensurabilists would not let go of the idea that the basic categories and concepts of Christian thought and practice and life were the kinds of things that, if Christians were to contribute anything, had to be the things that Christians were to contribute. And the problem that they faced was that both of them were right. So what could they do? Well, all this changed, or began to change, over the past decade. A new generation grew up who had learned the lessons of both sides, or so they thought, and appreciated the distinctiveness of Christian approaches and agreed that Christian political engagement had to be understood on its own terms, but also that those terms did not stymie genuine dialogue, collaboration, and engagement. These thinkers were fundamentally theologically disciplined, but they see in theology an urge towards a certain kind of engagement and the possibility of real collaboration. In other words, Christianity does not have to be applied to engage other thinkers in the world. Christianity is all about engaging other thinkers in the world. To unpack this vision, they took a step back from immediate political questions and immediate methodological questions about how to contribute to these debates, and asked more basic theological and ecclesial questions. At their deepest, these theologians of public life blossomed into a theology of worldly life and creation in general, a theology of the world, understood as waiting to receive its fullest being as God's creation. Now we can attempt to discern, as these thinkers do, in deep historical traditions and deep historical figures, the resources to see profane politics not as a demonic site of collaboration, nor a matter of histrionic but futile witness, like mimes performing before a blind audience, but an occasion of real, genuine dialogue and even possibly sacramentally real, genuine if proleptic, participation in God's work on earth. Of course, such a theology of public life must first and foremost be a church theology, pedagogically focused, a discipline of strongly communal soul formation. And the community that is forming the souls is a community built around the idea that our desires are properly shaped and cultivated, interested in shaping each other's desires, and in cultivating our desires, our capacities as doxological creatures, that is, creatures who are organized around the capacity to praise. Right? The human is, for these churches, a creature whose capacity for living a life, not only with their lips, but with their lives of joyful praise to God, that capacity is central to who these creatures are. And the churches are then those institutions that aim to give us a communal and personal, intellectual and affective structure to help us cultivate joy, our cultivation of which is the church's ultimate purpose. They shape a liturgically structured discipline whereby we are, in Augustine's lovely phrase, trained by our longings to become fit citizens of the kingdom of heaven. Now, of necessity, this training is evangelical and thus interested in public engagement, right? It aims to help Christian communities pursue the deepening in its members' souls and the widening in others and in society as a whole of the body of Christ on earth, of the church. And of course, this training is not one that humans inaugurate. We discover ourselves always already on the way in this training. On some level, the most we can do is beseech the Holy Spirit to come. The churches are simply the location where that training has its central locus in human history. But if the church is understood in this way, if you have a general theology of the churches that's this sort of thing, inevitably they'll be political. Right? The church's own distinctive liturgy of citizenship most centrally fits humans for the heavenly city, the ecclesial republic, the celestial republic, the republic of grace. Only secondarily do these trainings have spillover effects for the this-worldly political shaping of their members. But they do have those effects. And calling the churches a republic of grace draws together superficially political and superficially religious concerns in ways that reveal all of them to be both religious and political at the same time. Indeed, in ways that call into question whether so tidy a divide is ever really plausible. After all, what we call politics is itself not simply a set of merely mundane negotiations about how to split up our worldly cares and concerns. It also asks existential and metaphysical questions about who we are and what kind of world we inhabit. Consider the discussion around the name of the Washington Redskins. This debate has hugely existential meanings, not just for various Native Americans around America, but also in important ways for the many people who are fans of the Redskins and have been fans for decades, perhaps for generations. There are third and fourth generation fans of the Washington. These are sad people in some important ways because the Redskins haven't been that great. They're not like the Bears, right? But nonetheless, the identity of a sports team can be quite important to who someone is. And this can also raise questions about what happens if a sports team changes its name. From being, as I am from Cleveland, I am well aware of the tragic fluidity of our social world and the fluidity of sports teams, not just LeBron James, but the very Cleveland Browns at one point vacated the city. But the fact that a thing that seems so, maybe to some of us, superficial and empty as the name of a sports team can actually have existential dimensions, ought to give us some picture of why, if we think about this for very long, the character of politics turns out to be not simply about who puts up what streetlights where and what kinds of books go in the libraries of our public schools, but actually touch on existential matters about who we are, who we understand ourselves to be, and who we are to care about. Politics, that is, cannot be mundane or merely mundane. It is itself gratuitous, excessive, a symbol of heaven, just like everything else that humans do. Right? A distant anticipation of what the kingdom of God will be like. Admittedly, such a vision of how religion can shape political life is, to say the least, indirect. After all, this implies that the true nature and implication of our political concerns is only intelligible in light of the larger question of the proper formation of our dispositions, our character. In short, our polity is part of our piety. Our cities are parts of our souls. Doesn't this inevitably instrumentalize life in this world for an otherworldly aim? That's a fair and deep concern about what I'm proposing here. Right? This is a kind of, on some important way, a kind of Kantian concern. Have I really given, does this proposal that suggests that politics is about training us for some other end, in some sense, does it give due respect to the actual nitty-gritty of the here and now of the political issues at hand? I don't think so. In fact, I think its indirectness is not a weakness of the approach, but its central strength. For the maladies of the polity that much political discourse currently laments are rooted in the maladies of the soul that the churches diagnose. That is, the generally recognized political problems that we experience in the day-to-day are themselves theological problems in a far country. And the pedagogy that the churches undertake is effective, primarily indirectly, for those more immediately political concerns as well. Therefore, it's only by coming clear on the central pedagogical and even ascetical tasks of the Christian churches, tasks for soul formation, that the central and the centrally church-centered focus of theology, that any theology can say something of real, if indirect, import to this worldly order. Now, such a project of soul formation in this way is in part a project of transforming our vision, cultivating the proper virtues. And this project of transforming vision can be understood as a project of giving Christians a certain kind of language, a grammar, a way of thinking about the world that is built from the ground up with the doctrines of Christian faith baked into it. Christians badly need such languages for both constructive and diagnostic reasons. In my own work, I've talked about it in terms of the distinct Augustinian construal of the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. Constructively and positively, I think the virtues offer a way of talking about human lives, and thus of understanding them, that is inextricably oriented toward proper Christian ideals. The transformation that the virtues allow us to have in our vision of the world is part of what Christian faith is all about. It will help Christians be both better Christians, and assuming they think that their Christian faith is an organic aspect of all parts of their lives, better citizens of their communities, their nations, and the world as a whole. But diagnostically and negatively, the virtues also offer insights. They offer a relatively fine-grained diagnostic analysis of the texture of the challenges and patterns of human life, challenges and patterns that affect our inhabitation of these virtues and the Christian way of life more generally. This diagnosis may in fact be of more immediate interest to non-Christians than the positive vision might be, though that too will likely be of interest to them. But the diagnosis may be of more immediate interest because they can feel these problems quite often, quite palpably in their own experience. I want to say something about that later as well. And crucially, the theological core of this vision continues to govern its political council. A radical eschatological publicity lurks at the heart of the Christian message, this theology insists. And the faith harbors a deep suspicion of notions of privacy and perhaps even private property. I don't necessarily mean to endorse this fully, but just note for a second, I'm teaching the City of God to my own students now, and note for a second that for a thinker like Augustine, the language of privacy is a language that is deeply and inextricably etymologically and conceptually related to a language of privation. And privation, of course, is the ontological mark of evil. Right? So the question of privacy is a theologically deeply troubled concept. I'm not suggesting we can throw it out before the eschaton, but I am suggesting that for a theology, for a tradition that prides itself on the idea that one day we will all stand before God, not just naked, but transparent, right? Which is kind of a weird thought. That concept, that theological image, will have all sorts of knock-on effects for how we think about politics in other ways, in other dimensions of our lives. Right? It is no accident that Augustine's confessions still remain, for all of their creaky antiquatedness, able to make ordinary 19-year-olds today squirm with the awkwardness of what they will talk about at times. Right? That's an interesting fact. And I think that's related to the fact that he thinks that privacy is, in fact, part of what the fundamental character of sin is. But we'll go there later. I'm not suggesting Augustine was in favor of nudist colonies or anything. Don't worry about that. Not before the eschaton, anyway. And once the eschaton comes, you'll be able to see through each other, so don't worry. You'll be able to see through me, so don't worry about that either. It'll be okay. All this is still merely an academic achievement, or maybe even now it's entertainment TV. But once this new understanding of politics is in place, what new insights can we see in light of it? How should it affect Christian life today? Well, as is so often the case in political matters, to solve one problem, or to think that you've solved one problem, is to uncover several more. And as I've come to think the proposal I just sketched out is a satisfactory framework, for me at least, to inhabit, the attempt to inhabit it has led me to realize there are other challenges that present themselves. I want to point to two large changes currently taking place and suggest that political theology will have to face both of them in the coming century. There are going to remain issues of power politics, of the struggles of nation states, and the struggles of individuals within those nation states to gain political recognition. Those troubles are not going to go away. But other rising challenges are going to confront those of us who are living in a situation where those challenges, power politics, identity politics, these sorts of things, are not immediately pressing concerns. And we need to attend to these sorts of challenges. They both work, the ones I want to talk about tonight, in complicated ways in anti-political and also sinful directions. On the one hand, we have the temptation of an idealistic cosmopolitanism that would eschew the gnarly work of politics and attempt to outflank it through direct humanitarian engagement. Maybe you've had some of that here. As admirable as some of the intentions of this move are, quite often effectively it works to undercut our most local responsibilities as particular citizens incarnated in a particular place and time. On the other hand, we have the temptation of a consumeristic infiltration of politics in such a way that that consumerism hinders the basic development of character that we ought to undertake. Both of these temptations powerfully tempt us with the lure of a way to evade politics, to retreat away from the rough ground of public life into illusory solitudes of purity, of our own devising. I want to turn briefly to them next. Well, almost next. But lest my grouchiness, which is coming up, be mistaken for apocalypticism, I want to give you this bit of good news, something you ought to know. We have never had it so good. The market world we live in brings us benefits and blessings unimagined by our ancestors. Our material lives are richer by far than any age before us. Your typical working-class person in the first world today lives amid more material comforts than did 19th century royalty. It is an astonishing fact that increasingly across the developed world, the central emerging medical problem is obesity. Think about that. Across the globe, the last several decades have seen the largest expansion of human wealth and human health in recorded history. Right? There is an interesting and at least partially plausible case to be made that the bourgeois virtues cultivated in this world are genuine moral virtues, fitting us more and more for flourishing and rich lives. And the worries I express in what follows should not be taken as an expression fundamentally of regret that the scope of human agency has expanded and continues to expand at breathtaking pace. Far from it. There remain too many people in the world for whom too much political agency is hardly a looming danger. Antibiotics and political equality are both really good things. None of this should be denied, nor should anyone take seriously complaints about this situation that suggest that it would be better for humanity on the whole or for us individually if we were to go back to the way we lived 2 or 3 centuries ago. Or rather, to be worried about it, we can take these complaints seriously, but not literally. Okay? For few who talk about going back to the land or going back to some previous construal of tradition, not tradition in general, but some previous construal, are really able to do so without relying on modern medicine, government, technology, and education. The material and cultural advances of our world are real and should be welcomed. And those interested in advancing the cause of truth and faith sound like nothing so much as sore losers when they deny the great good that modernity has brought us. What's worse, their attempts to avoid admitting those truths lead them into hysterical apocalypticisms, which are as pedagogically unhelpful for their own communities as they are empirically unrealistic. While hysterically apocalyptic but covertly self-congratulatory modes of lament may not be right, nonetheless, we have to say our overall situation is far from hunky-dory. Okay, so here comes the grumpiness. For all modernity's advances, the fundamental situation of the human has not changed. Yes, some contingent problems that have bedeviled humans from time immemorial are receding, at least for now. And yes, more humans are able to exercise their agency more fully than they have in the past. But beneath these changes beats the same human heart, a heart at war with God, with itself, with its neighbors. And just as in the days of Cain, sin still crouches at our door. My view, and I say in fear and trembling, any minimally Christian view, will depart from any kind of enlightenment, optimism, and progressivism, first and foremost in this, in insisting that the changes we have made, while many are very good indeed and deserve our endorsement, approbation, and defense, do not change the fundamental human situation in any real sense of change. And that's why I want to identify 2 new permutations of the challenges humans have always faced from time immemorial. Right? As our first challenge, consider the astonishing rise in the past century, and especially the past 40 years, and especially in the past 15 years, of a concern for a global humanitarianism. An example will show what I mean. And if we were doing this talk in 2 weeks, I fear, alas, I would have a new really good example with the huge cyclone that just hit the Philippines, right? People have been following this. Something like around 10,000 people, they think, are obliterated. All right, I got you. Great. Okay. That was actually a trick. It is true, of course, that people died in the Philippines and 10,000 people. That's all true. That's terrible. For me, in my mercenary way, though, I have shown that you also are susceptible to the moral revolution, what I'm talking about here. Consider the worldwide response to the December 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. That was a horrible, horrible thing. I remember waking up on the 27th. It happened on the 26th, and we knew already there was some people died. But then as the next week went on, it got worse and worse. And part of the way it got worse and worse is that we got less and less confident about any numbers whatsoever. In the end, somewhere between 250,000 and 400,000 people were annihilated in that. And we still don't know the numbers because there were never any reliable census data to begin with. Right? Unbelievable. In the wake of that catastrophe, many commentators compared the responses to the tsunami to the responses to the Lisbon earthquake of 1755. An interesting study to do. Very, very similar event. An earthquake followed by a huge tsunami that wipes out the city of Lisbon. About 60, 70,000 people are destroyed or annihilated. And many commentators bemoaned the fact that, unlike Lisbon, the 2004 tsunami provoked little discussion, public discussion, about the implications of the tsunami for debates about the existence of a good God. But such discussions, or absence thereof, were not the most interesting thing about the worldwide response to the tsunami. The most interesting thing was the worldwide response itself, which is, I think, what we're about to see with the Philippines as well. A response, by the way, I endorse. I'm not mocking it, I'm endorsing it. But unlike in Lisbon, the tsunami provoked not philosophical speculations, but food drives and massive financial donations. The question was not asked, what kind of God would allow this suffering, but rather, what human errors permitted this suffering, and how can we help in the present to alleviate it, and how can we act in the future to ensure that it does not happen again? Right? That's a fascinating shift. And this is not because people in the 18th century were more callous than people today. The difference lies centrally in the relative power of humans before the onslaught of nature. Where once natural disasters would provoke wonder and awe, because that was pretty much the only possible response to them. In the 21st century, we have the power to act in response, and if we cannot prevent them, we'll at least try to repair them. I guarantee you that along with immediate humanitarian aid to the Philippines, in the next 6 months to 18 months, you will see a series of international efforts that are designed to help people in the Central Pacific, maybe, who are dealing with massive cyclones, to generate better structures, a better infrastructure for saving people or rescuing them in this and immediately solving it, right? This is all good. This is all a sign of our moral success in some important way. But it also raises a whole new set of interesting philosophical and, I think, theological questions. God knows repair is needed in our world. Consider the continuing reality of horrific impoverishment and immiseration across the world. All of us can agree that having more than 1 billion people, 1,000 million people, a large proportion of whom are children, living in extreme poverty, is a horrific reality. But, and this is important, what has changed is that today we do see such horrible immiseration as horrible, and as such, demanding our moral response. After all, for most of human history, while it was considered unfortunate, poverty was also considered inevitable. Today we think that we can do something about it. Today we think we can fix it. If I had time, I could give you a nice juicy quote from Bono. It says we can fix it. And if Bono says it, it must be true. And for us, can rapidly becomes should. This is an enormous transformation. One of the largest moral transformations in recorded human history. And it's literally happened under our noses while those of us who are slightly older than some of you have been alive. This desire to repair all injuries, our burgeoning sense of an obligation to do so, supports the emergence of what thinkers such as Charles Taylor and Michael Ignatieff have called the moral revolution of modernity. This moral revolution mobilizes our concern for strangers far away and makes us work actively, however minimally, lamely, clumsily, and haltingly, yet intentionally and directly, to ensure their well-being. Today, as never before in history, we genuinely feel the claims of other humans on us simply because of our common humanity, no matter how far away they may be from us in space. Theoretically, possibly also in time. It's another argument, though. We find ourselves driven both by a sense of obligation to them and by the conviction that their suffering is not inevitable, that the poor need not always be with us, that the world's wounds can be healed. Right? The moral revolution here is actually two equally radical and interrelated transformations. One in our understanding of our characteristic moral beings, the other in our expectations for what a tolerable moral world should look like. First, modernity has witnessed the construction of an extraordinary moral culture, one that burdens its inhabitants with ever higher demands for concern for all of the humans. This does not mean that humans are becoming any better at meeting the requirements of the obligations we feel, that we are becoming more morally good, that is to say. But what has happened is that now we feel a wider range of moral obligations than we ever have before. It's not that we are more moral, but that more of our situation, more of our context, more of our horizon feels moralized to us. The history of this revolution is long and complicated, but most importantly, for my purposes, it involved the secularization of Christian beliefs about the end of time, which transformed eschatological claims into utopian ones. On this view, the kingdom is coming is not merely a reality deferred to the end of time. It ought to be our aim here and now. 100 years ago, in the American social gospel movement, it very much was. It's a fascinating fact. Very few 18th century Englishmen would have concerned themselves with the death rates of Africans. Today, it is a real concern to many. The second transformation in this moral revolution is visible in the assumption, common today, that suffering is a contingent and accidental fact about human life, not inevitable, able to be eliminated or fixed. This is at once its fundamental strength and its tragic flaw. Our growing confidence in our own power is crucial. There's been a change in our attitude to suffering and pain, from one fundamentally of acceptance of those realities as natural and inescapable facts about the human condition, to an attitude fundamentally of outrage and revolt against those facts, now seen as fixable accidents. I have, from time to time, asked people in my class if they would raise their hands if they will die, which is a remarkably invasive thing to ask people, and to actually kind of have a teacher compel you to raise your hand and say, yes, I will die. Not to say it out loud, although maybe I'll do that too. But what's fascinating is that I have, when I've done this, a couple times anyway, received comments from students later that this struck them as, in some important way, an inappropriate invasion of their reality, which is an interesting formulation in itself, but also, I didn't know it was your reality. Sorry. Where do you buy that? But it's also just a fact. It's very interesting. The question of what it means to teach somebody, there are clear limits on the things you might, I mean, it's not like I'm asking them, will you get a social disease now or in the future, but something that looks pretty straightforward, right? But it's actually quite potentially, it can be construed as an act of pedagogical aggression on the part of a teacher, which is interesting. Today, resignation in the face of suffering is not seen as wisdom, but insulting, morally troubling, perhaps spiritually troubling to many of us. Not to rage against the dying of the light is seen as a sign of defeatism. Again, this encourages in us awesome moral energies, but it ties those energies to the conviction that our exertions will sooner or later be rewarded with the elimination of our true enemies, evil, suffering, and death. Both of these revolutions seem suspect to me. The first, regarding the resolution in our self-understanding as moral agents, this kind of expansion of who we should care about. Ought we to be so morally driven without an articulate sense of why we should care? I don't think we should. And I actually share good company with Nietzsche. Nietzsche thought that something like this would be the last spasm of what he called slave morality. Slave morality is what happens in part when the express moral commands of a society are altogether disconnected from, or at best indeterminately related to, the actual energies motivating human life in that society. And the moral revolution seems in some important ways an example of this. It is powerfully instrumentalizing of us all and demands rigorous methodologies of control. And soon enough, the desire to do good becomes confused with and then potentially replaced by the desire to control, to discipline. The aim shifts from justice to power, and any force or reality or condition restricting our sheer power becomes gradually immoral, including any restrictions that we ourselves put in the way. The irony is palpable. A desire for freedom, for power, for liberty enchains us, we become slaves to increasing our power for the sake of advancing the moral revolution itself, a moral revolution that we were the ones to inaugurate. We become slaves, that is, to the mindless advance of liberty. And if I were to summarize the entire tradition of moral inquiry from Nietzsche through Michel Foucault, in some ways going back to someone like Tocqueville, this is what they're sort of trying to say. As Walt Kelly's character Pogo once said, "We have met the enemy, and he is us." Nietzsche looks more prophetic every year as his diagnosis of the fundamental problems of a post-Christian society trying to hold on to a Christian morality comes increasingly to resemble our world. But I think few of us are very interested actually in inhabiting the alternative Nietzsche offers. And if we don't want to do that, what do? That's one kind of way I find this worrisome. The second worry about the perfectibility of our world. Of course, our moral energies are most often provoked by confrontations with evil and suffering. But is it wise to tie the ultimate justification of these energies to our chances of overcoming them? Evil and suffering seem pretty eliminable characteristics of the human condition as we inhabit it. If we root our moral energies in the conviction that all our problems can be once and for all resolved, the inevitable, I would propose inevitable, discovery that they cannot be so resolved could result in endless vexation and perhaps a deepening resentment of and cynicism about those very moral energies. Getting us back to Nietzsche, by the way. Of course, it's always possible simply to try harder, to insist that the solution to modernity is more modernity, to believe, that is, that the problem is our residual, if partial, captivity to archaic, pre-modern notions of self and community and world, and our solution is to more fully accomplish our liberation, make all of us properly free agents and individuals. But we needn't find such urgings to be compelling. If, as Santayana put it, fanaticism is doubling your efforts when you have forgotten your aim, such changes suggest that our moral revolution threatens to become fanatical. Now, I have a very articulate, powerful, and brilliant, really brilliant analysis of what Christians should do in reply. And I'm going to skip that because I want to get to my second one. But let me quickly say this. Can I walk this way? I'm sorry, I don't mean to be. Christians can do three basic things in light of the moral revolution. On the first hand, I think there's an enormous power for good in it, and it should be endorsed. It has to be recognized as the outworkings in some important way of, at least Christians can recognize it as the outworkings in some important way of moral dynamics that are central to the Christian gospel and have been since Jesus, and perhaps even since the people of Israel. And they're incredibly powerful moral achievement to have the kind of moral culture we live in. But at the same time, there are certain kinds of chastenings that Christians can engage with their neighbors who are also part of the moral revolution in. A certain set around the question of the moral anthropology this picture proposes. Right? Another set around the picture of the moral ontology, the moral horizon the picture proposes. Both of these are things that Christians ought to engage their neighbors in discussions about, and about the wisdom of this particular construal, or the implications of their own beliefs about how to live in the world. In other words, I am not suggesting that Christians jump off this ship. I am just suggesting, though, Christians need to participate more thoroughly in the navigation of the ship, rather than just riding along as passengers. Let me say something quickly about the second challenge, though. And I really want to get to the second paragraph, and I have just enough time to do it. Okay. Well, if one challenge is about the moral changes leading to hyper-agency, which is also ironically ending up as a kind of slavery, right? The other is sort of its opposite. For a long time, thinkers have worried that the basic structures of liberal capitalist consumer society, say that 5 times quickly, strongly encourage us, in us, the development of a culture of luxury that vitiates the energies its members need to develop into a virtuous citizenry. Right? These worries go back to the Romans. I mean, these are old worries about wealth. Such markets, the worries go, tend to create not healthy political agents, but rather fundamentally consumerist creatures. Post-industrial society generates post-material cultures, which in turn sculpt their inhabitants in dangerous ways. Our contemporary consumer society, for all its many blessings, this worry goes, entails a soul craft about which we should have serious reservations. Do you think this is overblown? If so, consider this. Consumerism and the advertising it relies upon is a genuinely new fact about our world, something our ancestors of even 100 years ago could not have imagined. But it is massive in our world today. We've always had markets, but consumerism adds to markets the practice of dedicating an ever greater amount of its wealth and energy to intentionally and substantially shaping human desire, and hence character, above all, by advertising. Contemplate these facts. The average 6-year-old child in the United States sees 40,000 commercial messages per year and can name approximately 200 brands. Each year in the United States, well over $100 billion is spent on advertising, and about $15 billion of that total is spent on advertising directed specifically at children. Worldwide, expenditures on advertising in the first decade, annually in the first decade, across the first decade of the 21st century, totaled something around $650 billion a year, making advertising the second biggest business in the world today after weapons. Those are some big numbers. And if you think about it, how old is the advertising industry? It's roughly about 100 years old. It really gets going as a structured, designed, intentional effort on the part of marketers to market products to consumers around the same time that World War I happens, just before, just after. Right? So this looks to me like an enormous material fact about our world that up until 100 years ago, no one had ever actually had reason to contemplate. No one had ever had reason to contemplate what it meant morally to us. Okay? Because of this, I think I would propose, and I have a much more powerful argument to propose it in, but I'll summarize. The dangers of this kind of consumerism for civic association and political life more generally are pretty profound. First of all, it cultivates in us a certain assumption that our happiness can be found in the products that are tried to be sold. Right? All are available to us. Our happiness is material, or at least quantifiable, and our aim in pursuing things is satiation. Second, it makes us shallow voluntarists, people who think that the most fundamental important acts about us, the most fundamental things we can do, are purchases or decisions to purchase or consume various objects, rather than think more broadly and deeply about what it means to be agents, responding to perhaps a creator God. And thirdly, it makes us individualists in a certain kind of way. Individualists and subjectivists, people whose aims center primarily around their individual satiation. In all these ways, I would propose, but especially the third, this as well, this other movement in our moral world, as well as cosmopolitan, the moral evolution, consumerism is also anti-political. It promises us happiness that we can reach not by engaging other people, but precisely by turning away from them. Either via Amazon, my own problem, I admit, or your own chosen online site or offline site. But each of us understands the lure of retail therapy, and each of us has confronted it in our own dark night of the retail soul. Now, in Christian terms, a resistance to this is easily constructed. Because Christians identify the fundamental aim of human life to be true joy, true happiness, at least as I'm proposing it here. I'm sure you've all bought into that already. Christians are able to accommodate the notion that humans seek happiness, but have misconstrued what it is in a consumeristic world. Furthermore, and there's a little more to say about the details of that, in terms of what agency would be like if we were not actually to find our true happiness in things, but in communion with other people, for example. Furthermore, there are many other people in the world with whom we can have common concern about this. There are many people, secular and other religious believers, of goodwill, who would be our allies in raising a campaign in favor of joy over against consumerist happiness and satiation. In doing that, we will be engaging once again in the practices of politics that I've proposed we ought to be engaged in. Now, let me conclude. It may seem odd to call both of these challenges distinctively political, but in fact, they both fundamentally are, at least negatively. The moral revolution is a form of anti-political utopianism, an attempt to escape the hard work of politics by engaging directly in moral reformation of the world. The rising tide of consumerism is a form of anti-political individual isolationism. Both are essentially hostile to our need of each other, at least insofar as that need entails the consequent need to recognize complexity and plurality and compromise, inescapable characteristics of life in this dispensation during the world. Both of these tendencies are not responsible ways to live in the world. They are not only anti-political, that is, they are more deeply escapist, attempts to flee the world. But in calling these challenges political in this way, I'm trying to say something deeply theological as well. For the Christian faith professes the incarnation, the crucifixion, and the resurrection of our Lord, and in doing so, teaches us something of our own destiny. We follow Christ in coming into the world and living in it as truly part of it, more truly worldly, in fact, than much of the rest of the world itself is, even as we await its transfiguration on the eschatological morning. But in that life, we can expect suffering, the suffering of life lived truly amidst sin and in sin. And the truer we are, the more such suffering will be gifted to us. And yet we are not allowed to wallow in that suffering, but must say to it, what you will do, do quickly. For it itself is a way station, however necessary, onto the fuller glory that awaits us and all creation in the resurrection. And any Christian political theology must finally be accountable to this story, truly part of the world, suffering in, with, and for that world, and yet always called, through Christ's grace, into a fuller, richer, truer life beyond the false worldliness that our fallen world allows. It is our fate. It is our destiny. That providence has determined to call us to live out this faith, this graceful vocation, in our particularly political era. Thank you. We have lots of time for the many questions I'm sure you all have, especially, what will you give me that will give me back the hour you have just taken from my life?
I have a question.
Yeah, Professor Baker.
So you mentioned you're teaching City of God, and the City of God in there, what you were just talking about.
You think?
Yes. How present or how eschatological are the two cities? Right. In other words, so because there are all these competing interpretations of Augustine, right? So because that also is going to play a role in terms of how much one would either dive into the participation in the world, or how much they would see themselves as firmly, well, I'm a citizen of this city, not that city.
Yeah.
So I was wondering how you think.
Yeah, you cut right to the chase, don't you? Yeah, well, there are, in fact, rival interpretations of this notion of the two cities. You have, I believe, on your campus a good representative of another interpretation than my own. I don't believe he's here. I don't know if Greg Lee is here.
He had gotten dinner.
Oh, he had gone in. But for thinkers of that sort, the argument is that in some important way, the Christian church is more fully realized in its integrity here in this world than the story I've put forward has. And in an important way, the Christian life seems to be one of not so much reaching out from the church as much as concerning yourself with building up the church and welcoming those who happen to find their way into it to sustain it in that way, but not having as a fundamental concern, not necessarily a primary concern, just a fundamental concern, the interest in engaging with people outside of that church. Since Mr. Lee is here, is not here, I can't really offer a terrible misrepresentation of this, but I'm doing my best. I think that actually the problem that Augustine and I, well, that's a great sentence, the problem that Augustine and I would have with that is that it's fundamentally Donatist. At least that seems to me hard to distinguish from the practice of the Donatist church that Augustine recognized as authentically Christian, in the sense that he was not rejecting the idea that these were Christians and that they had they had successful baptisms and successful Eucharist and things like that. But that they were flawed in their understanding of what it seems to me the church's mission is. And that they actually expressed a certain kind of fear that they didn't need to express. The famous moment when Stanley Hauerwas was named America's Theologian by Time magazine 1 or 2 weeks before 9/11 was a delightful and interesting thing for poor Professor Hauerwas, someone I know and admire very much. Just because if his view was right, he should have been a beaten and abused man. He certainly should not be given accolades as America's theologian in this particular way. And so I suspect that many of the people who move in these more Donatistic directions are actually not simply participating in a certain kind of recoil back into a closed-off Donatistic sort of church. I actually also think they're engaged in a certain kind of Christian identity politics that you see a lot of in other forms of other aspects of our culture today. There's a whole economic infrastructure built around shoring up Christian self-identity. There's, as we all know, music, culture, movies, T-shirts, festivals, intellectual and non-intellectual, health clubs. There's an entire subculture, right? And of course, that's all part of the larger consumer context in which we live. Everybody's identity, in fact, you probably have multiple identities that you can choose from to accentuate your subculture. I don't think there are any Swedish-American, well, there's Ann Sather. Apart from that, though, I don't think there's many, there's many identities that are hard to activate, but there are lots of identities that you have lots of opportunities to economically activate. And I think the problem with a lot of the more realized pictures of the church, on the one hand, is that they don't realize how much that realization is actually a cultural, not a theological realization. The other aspect of it that is problematic is that it suggests that the picture of the church that Augustine, I propose Augustine is offering, is not realized. But as I take it, the picture of the church that I understand Augustine to be offering is very much in complete continuity with a church that was founded in part with the membership of Peter and Judas, right? It seems to me rather to hasten the apocalypse to suggest that somehow we're doing better than the disciples. And the disciples were not actually very good Christians. So therefore, it seems a bit presumptuous to suggest we could be better. That's my general view on that. Yeah.
Very interested in Christian resources for challenging and trying to deepen the kind of cultural conversation of freedom that we have in this country. And I was really interested in your talk when you spoke about the hyper-agency of the moral revolution and the shallow voluntarism of the consumer society. I'm just wondering how you frame that discussion, let's say in your classroom when you're talking about Christian freedom versus what passes as freedom and agency in popular culture or in other civic discourse.
The example I typically use is talking about falling in love, and I don't mean with another person, although if that works for you, fine. I mean in terms of when was the last time you noticed that you really, really liked a book or a song or any number? It was always retrospective. So many of the most important things in our lives happen, and then we realize they've happened already. And yet the narrative we have from our most successful, most saleable picture of agency is always proactive. I formulate a desire, I go out and get it. I didn't mean to fall in love with the woman who became my wife. I mean, she's Canadian, first of all. That's a problem right there, right? Biracial marriage, who wants that? Those are not the way. And if you were to frame that to someone who you loved, right? Or if you frame it as the way you discover a book that you like, or your major. Think about all the existential decisions you make. How many of them are actually made from an act of voluntarism? Right? Most of the time, it's about discovering in yourself, listening to yourself, and finding out certain things. That's a picture of agency that, my old teacher, Bill Schweiker, talks about as responsibility, where human action, Luther says, the human is more acted upon than acting. And the human action seems to me almost always responsive to things before it. All of our existentially most fraught decisions are ones, it seems to me, that are secondary upon us realizing something that we did not choose. Right? And Charles Taylor has a wonderful essay, which is broadly apprehensible by undergrads, it seems to me, called Responsibility for Self, which he takes on Jean-Paul Sartre, actually, explicitly on this matter, and tries to bring into view the way that most of our life is not in that way chosen. Right? Acknowledged, affirmed, recognized, these are words we can work with. Chosen, it seems less real. Right? None of this is meant to undo an important recognition of agency. Right? It's rather to bring more fully into view what kind of agents we actually are. One of my favorite quotes from the philosopher Iris Murdoch is, and it's in the longer and more brilliant part of this bit, is man is that creature that makes pictures of himself and then comes to resemble the picture. And I think that we do ourselves a deep disservice, individually and culturally, when we tell ourselves a story of what kinds of creatures we are that is based around a kind of pretty shallow voluntarism. Is that getting at something?
I thought it was interesting you mentioned the secularization of Christian values and culture. What should we make of that as Christians, particularly as we go about engaging politics and culture?
Yeah, well, two things. I mean, I'm using it in a somewhat annoying sense here because I don't mean to be saying that Christianity goes away when I'm talking about this. Certainly to some people in the 18th and 19th and then the 20th centuries, Christianity does decay, and they're left with this kind of moral substructure of Christianity, but they don't have the vocabulary for it anymore that they used to have. And so there is a kind of potential to hear this as a decline narrative. The other way to hear it, and I don't want to deny the decline narrative in some important ways, but the other way to hear it is as a remarkable success story, that something happens in the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, and this moral story has still not been written. Taylor has written some of it, but something happens after 1,500 years of Christianity. Christianity, which had a pretty vivid picture of Christendom, right? So the category of Christendom, which is an extra-national category in some way, exists. But then suddenly the world as a whole comes into view as an object of immediate moral concern. And over time, the world begins to be more and more occupying of the entirety of the moral concern, right? The last time, I just read a book that had this in it, the last time that the category of Christendom was actually used in an official legal document was in a treaty in like 1715 or something like that. It's really interesting. And it's just about, 60 years before you get the really first big movements against what's effectively the global slave trade. So there's a more complicated story to be told. What Christians can do is simultaneously, I think, hang out and be themselves and say, well, actually, we haven't gone away. Hello. And also say, you know, I appreciate what you're trying to do, and I affirm it in these ways. It looks to me like you're doing things that are pretty continuous with stuff I want to do. You seem to think perhaps we have some large divide on this stuff. Maybe we do. We could talk about that. But at the same time, let's work on these things together. And we'll see what comes of that, right? But it is a fact that the world we live in is paradoxically, Charles Taylor sort of says this actually, is paradoxically canonically Christianized, even as it has annihilated its own Christian identity, or has begun to annihilate its own Christian identity, right? And he's talking about this in a secular age, but I think I've seen it elsewhere too. And that's pretty ironic. Not something I think Christians, at least Christian theologians, want to endorse. They'll put me out of business, so I don't want that. But I think it's an interesting thought. And what's interesting also, and Hans Joas's new book on the history of human rights has some of this as well. So Samuel Moyn, who's a big opponent of this way of reading this stuff. Anyway, there's an ongoing argument that's to be had there that's worth thinking about. Is that getting at some of that? So, yeah. And then Brian, yeah.
Well, so Derrida, in his essay on forgiveness, talks about all of these odd places in the late 20th century that people start using the language of apology and forgiveness. The president gets on TV and very insincerely says, "I'm so sorry, will you forgive me?" But there's this sort of question of, like, how sincerely do you want to be forgiven, and is this really a ploy to escape punishment? Derrida's point is, suddenly at the heads of state in Asian countries, going on TV and basically using this sort of Christian language without any of the kind of context to make it happen. Actually, my question has to do with this Christendom idea, which has to do with your thinking about the church as a global body now. And I love so much of this paradigm, and I think it's such a fantastic way for talking about the way in which local churches are so important for forming the way that we think politically and behave politically. And as an Augustinian, you have a very robust way of thinking about the church as a larger body moving through history.
So wait, where's the tomahawk coming from?
Okay, so
I'm waiting for it.
here's what I want to know.
You're so good looking and so charming,
Yes.
and yet.
What claims do my brothers and sisters in Africa and New Zealand and China have on me as a Christian? And is there a language for thinking about responsibilities across borders and perhaps even outside of one's country or region proper that predates the sort of massive moral revolution where every other human being is potentially an object of my moral concern?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I don't mean to be making it too one-sided, I should admit right away. The moral revolution is not just a successful semi-Christianization in the sense that we now care about people all around the world in a particular way. It's also, interestingly, a Christianization of the incredible spread of this category of the human as you know, the question of who is my neighbor, of the Good Samaritan here, which is interesting in its own way. Right? Remember, the Good Samaritan's not a Jew. Right? This is very important, right? Like, the great example for Jesus of the right, it's like Pope Francis saying, let me tell you about a good Christian. First of all, he's not a Christian, right? So there's a weird way in which, like, Jesus is playing with your expectations there. But we still live in a very Westphalian world, more conceptual, both conceptually and institutionally. And I think that's good. I think the nation state's an enormously successful technology. It's an enormously successful device. Probably the best bit of technology of the last 500 years, even counting the iPod. And I think it's important for us to to not only just respect it, but to continue to use it. I don't think we can go to a kind of sheer cosmopolitanism of individual things. There are other institutions out there that want us to do that, and they're mostly interested in making money. And so I don't think that's a good idea. And there is a way in which Christian cosmopolitanism predates the nation state in this way. And I do think that notions of Christendom have some purchase on some extra Westphalian purchase on our minds. But Christendom itself had borders. So I think there are trajectories and energies in the Christian moral and political vocabularies that we've had that give us some ways to work on this, but I don't think that they offer us solutions yet. So much of this depends upon the puzzle of what happens in the 16th and 17th, especially the 16th century, around the discovery of the New World and the idea that there are people who were completely left out of the biblical narratives. That question is, hugely important for the development of moral anthropology and Enlightenment notions of the human. Anthony Pagden has done really good work on this, among others. And it's a theologically rich and charged issue, right? Because it looks like these peoples are nowhere. The Bible was not just a kind of political and theological tract, it was also an atlas. And now suddenly it looks like we're going to wait for the Mormons to come and tell us how this works? And what are we going to do? The question is, how do we deal with this puzzle? And I think it's an interesting puzzle. Have I answered that at all? I'm not sure if I did. I talked about it. I talked around it. But yeah, what do you want me to say? What do you want me to say? No, seriously, what do you want me to say? I don't think I have any reason to disagree with the idea that there could be extra national things. My worry would be entirely that the other source of this kind of cosmopolitanism would inevitably move in the kind of stoic and naturalizing directions. It doesn't have to. Noah, you have help here, please?
Well, yeah, I guess the way I look at the question is can you embrace the expansion of moral agency that you embraced early on in the talk, not unproblematically or uncritically, but can you embrace that without embracing being encumbered or burdened by the expansion of moral horizons to the rest of the globe?
I don't want to not be encumbered. I want to accept those moral horizons. They've always been there for Christians, as I understand it.
That's what I think.
Yeah. But I also want to be worried about the way in which maybe certain formulations of those horizons are articulated now in this context. Brian, you have a...
So maybe this is a bit more concrete version of the same question, but it seems fairly obvious in one sense about sort of what would it mean to press against the kind of shallow consumerism that is, prevalent in so much of American global culture and whatnot. It seems less obvious what does it mean to press against this moral revolution. I mean, does this mean to be the curmudgeon when your friends all put up on Facebook that you should donate to the Philippines first aid, Red Cross? No, I don't. It's a little bit. Yeah, it's less. Because I think part of the problem is that it's pretty easy to recognize. I think most people recognize that the person who is totally consumed by the acquisition of new gadgets is living this kind of stunted life.
I thought you were going to say it's me, but okay.
No.
It's me.
But the person who is, in a sense, overcommitted to the good of everybody, everywhere, right, is less obviously wrong. I mean, they're exhausted very quickly, and all kinds of problems come with that.
Right.
But they're not necessarily aiming badly from the first step. And so
Absolutely not. Right. But nor is the consumerist, right? This is the first step of this thing about consumerism is to say, yes, we all seek happiness. Let's go from here. And I actually think, the whole cultural studies thing where people were saying, no, consumerism is really effective and transgressive and it's really powerful. I think it's mostly gooby, but it's legitimate to the point that actually giving people these options for purchasing things has, in fact, it seems to me, expanded the range of modes of expression and stuff like that in ways that are possibly good. You know, I mean, I thought my Legos as a kid were fine. I actually wish my kids' Legos were more like mine, but you know, it works for them, so I'm not worried about that. But I think that the real job here, and it's an interesting job, is to produce a non-smug, non-smarky Christian version of what Foucault and Nietzsche are trying to do, and Tocqueville. That whole line of aristocratic critics of modernity, who actually identify the problem of modernity is the loss of the noble soul, right? This is what they're all about. That what we lose here is honor and passion, and we get the robotic human. Right? This is Weber, too. Weber's in this line. And I think there's something powerful to that, and I think that actually the one place in the Christian world I find that today, and this is just me, is actually in the so-called paleocons. So a guy near here, Patrick Deneen at Notre Dame, is very good, I think, in just these ways, and being grumpy in the right ways. And I think it's important because I do think that at the same time, I can begin from the level of anecdote, and I would want someone else to get sufficient funding to raise it to the level of theory. We live in a world where simultaneously we have enormous amounts of freedom to exercise behavior and stuff like that. But if you read Norbert Elias on the history of manners, or if you read some Foucault, you realize the range of acceptable human behavior even 100 years ago would have been radically more expansive than today. I talked to my students about 100 years ago in our classes in Virginia, well, like half the people wouldn't be there at all, right? Because they're either women or people of color. But the other thing that would be there would be spittoons. Right? Imagine living in a world where people like have big chunks of tobacco and are spitting them out all the time in a classroom, right? I mean, and that's just a very trivial example of this. But in other words, at the same time that we've had this enormous expansion of agency and freedom and inclusiveness and all these good things, people are a lot more alike today than they used to be.
So, but the difference, it's an interesting answer, because the difference, I think, between, say, Tocqueville and, say, Nietzsche and Foucault is that where Tocqueville then turns around and celebrates institutions that sort of, constrain us. I mean, yeah, there's this kind of noble soul.
Yeah, you're right.
The noble soul is leading us in certain ways and is forming us. Neither Nietzsche, and more particularly for Foucault, they're especially Foucault is celebrating a kind of libertinism, right? I mean, it's a let's wreck it.
Yeah, even if he's doing anything, it's hard to figure out. But that's what I mean, a non-smug. I mean, I think that this is why I want to highlight Tocqueville. I think Tocqueville, and Weber too, in a certain way, has another.
Weber is just, but he's of course, dyspeptic about the whole thing.
Yeah, he needs to like take a couple big bags of Prozac and just kind of freebase that stuff. Or what I don't know what it is. He was a dark guy. That's a great example, by the way, of what happens to the people in a therapeutic culture. I've just dismissed Max Weber with a little joke about pills. No, I think that's right, that Weber was very dyspeptic, but that's also because, unlike Tocqueville, he actually was a far more serious scholar of institutions. So maybe he was more worried about that. But I do think that, we put this out here for the Wheaton crowd, a proper Christian sociology would actually be desperately needed. My colleague, James Hunter, some of us know James real well, is trying to do that and to change the world. And a chipper Augustinian like me finds that far too cynical. But maybe he's right. Or at least maybe he's onto something that I don't want to admit. Right? Anyway, I think that there's a way in which that research project, right, carried forward in kind of fugitive ways by people like Deneen on the one hand and Hunter on the other, is an important part of a broader vision of cultural life today. For Christians, and I think for others. I think that the insights of Deneen and Hunter are not only of value to others, I think they're actually of interest to lots of people who aren't Christian. I think that's unsurprising. Yeah.
So you did mention at the beginning, so you're in Cambridge for a year, and you're noting the contrast being the UK versus being the United States. So it's just interesting to think about Christian agency in a country like the United States vis-a-vis in a country like the UK. And say a little bit more about your observations, having been over there, and perhaps what being over there, how that informed the way you see the way that Christians on these shores think about, or perhaps could think about their.
Yeah, well, I don't claim any expertise in 9 months. Much of it spent in in Oxbridge colleges, which are hardly representative of the United Kingdom as a whole, right? Main complaint is that the claret was off when there. The Stilton was not good. I heard that a couple times. It's not as prime as before. I would say, so this is really, really flimsy. The UK is actually, in some really interesting ways, a far more Christian country than the US is. The role of establishment is something that I think the Brits don't fully understand how pervasive it is. And that's interesting in itself, first of all. Right, all the colleges at Oxford and Cambridge, I believe all of them, including the ones founded very recently, have chaplains. And by chaplains, I mean priests in the Church of England. Right? So I mean, like they're authorized, and they're voting members, and sometimes they're quite powerful members. Christ Church is the second wealthiest college in Oxford and Cambridge. Wealthiest is Trinity in Cambridge, but Christ Church in Oxford is the second wealthiest. And by second wealthiest, I mean about £1 billion, which is like 1.8 or so billion US. Pretty good, Place has 150 scholars and maybe 500, 600 students. So that's pretty good numbers, right? The dean of Christ Church has to be a clergy, right? That's an interesting fact, right? Because remember, the faculty of these colleges own the college. There's no board of visitors, there's no trustees. They're it, right? So the dean of Christ Church is Donald Trump, effectively. So there's this incredible infiltration, and not just in the institutions, right, and the House of Lords, all these things, huge. But also in, I think, the cultural ethos. There are certain ritual holidays and stuff like that are very Christianized. And then also it's deeply unchristian, much less Christian. And the kinds of very common activities you would see in America, like, I don't know, going to church, don't happen in the UK very much. And I think that's a really interesting fact, that institutionally on one level it can be so heavily Christianized, far more than us, and yet on another level it's not much at all. Is it going away? The institutional stuff seems pretty stable. They're about as likely to overthrow the monarchy and institute a republic, which is always possible in the UK. What I think was most interesting for me, though, was the sense I had, and this I say very, very tentatively, and if anyone else has been in the UK for a while, it would be interesting to know from your point of view, but the sense I have of the enormous shadow of World War I over the whole place. Every one of the every one of the Oxbridge colleges has a wall of remembrance, which is attached, right? And has all the names of all the students. And fully, you're talking like half of the classes of like 10, 12, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, half of those classes are up on those walls, right? Because especially the young men were basically second lieutenants, right? And they were basically they had half-lives of 20 minutes on the front lines. And they had been trained to think of themselves as, anyway, so and this really marked them, I think, in a profound way. And it was a moral defeat, even if it was a moral victory on some basic way. Something about the way this war struck the nation. They never really got over it. And I mean, they were able to rally in World War II and do really well. But it struck me as a very interesting fact. And if England, if this could happen in England, there's no doubt it could happen here. And I think that one of the great tragedies of the 20th century, of the first half of the 20th century, was, I'm sort of a Tory, right, what was the collapse of the British Empire. Not the loss of it, not the decolonization, but the failure of the Brits in the 20s and 30s to stand up to the Italians and the Germans in the way that they had stood up to the Russians and the French in the 1880s and 90s and before World War I. Well, 70s, 80s, and 90s for the Russians and French. And so there was a vacuum of world order because the US was busy, I don't know, doing flapper things or whatever it was we were doing. We were all asking for a dime or whatever in the 30s. And so there was a vacuum of power. And if I'm at my best as an Augustinian, I want to say there are many reasons to be affectionate towards the United States, but the reason that I want the United States right now to be powerful in the world, God help us all, is because if we don't do it, who else will? You talk to people in the States about it, right? You want the Chinese to run things? Really? Is that your best bet? Like what? You want the Brazilians? Right? Can't even organize a soccer game. And so, I mean, this is a very cynical way of looking at it, but the worry I have about the imperial power thing is merely that we could lose the capacity to serve as instruments in some way of order in the world. But I don't know.
Is there a final question? Yeah.
I was really interested when you talked about the range of our moral obligations expanding. I wonder if you could answer the question, do you think they've really expanded or whether they've just shifted? And in light of that, also, how do you think the moral revolution has impacted our personal exercise of the virtues?
At first, I thought that was going to be a clever question about the difference between the epistemology and the ontology of moral obligations. But I think you might have asked a more profound question than that. When you say shifted, are you suggesting that we've lost a focus on those closer to us in some important way? Well, this is the allegory. I mean, there's some weird, relatively flaky psychology experiment about this, right? That more people will jump in to rescue a puppy in a subway than like a person who falls in a subway, right? We have these sorts of things. And it might be the case that the far away person is at least stigmatized in a morally important way that allows them to be the object of more spectatorial moral concern. And so in a way, it's more comfortable for us to care about them than it would be those around us, right? So I'm not going to help the homeless people I walk by on my way to the World Vision office or whatever in the morning or whatever. The famous Princeton experiments, you guys, some people might, I'm sorry, I'm sure you guys remember these too, but the Princeton experiments where they gave a seminarian a sermon and said, you have to be across campus at the Princeton Chapel in 5 minutes to give this sermon, and then it was about the Good Samaritan. And along the way, they have a guy dressed up like a homeless guy who's like, can you help me? Can you help me? And no, you cannot. I've got to get to give my sermon. Get out of my way, right? Brilliant. This is one of these. Satan is behind the whole field of social psychology, but Satan won this day. This is a day, you got to give him one day. It's a very interesting moment, right, where it turns out that the temporal urgency actually can misshape your thing there. So in a way, the framing of moral concern, if what you're asking about, the larger cultural framing of moral concern as concern for people far away, yeah, I think that matters a lot. In a similar way, right, in America, the framing of social concern for things like welfare and social services support and stuff like that, right? America, since the 80s, maybe since the 70s, has framed concern for these social welfare programs racially, right? Effectively, poor black women in the inner city who have lots of Cadillacs are the ones who are on welfare, right? That's not true in any statistic whatsoever, right? I mean, I live near where the center of gravity of welfare and stuff like that is, because I live right near Appalachia, right? I mean, basically, it's rural white people, right, who are the people who actually employ social welfare policies. And by and large, young rural white people. Other people might call them children. But anyway, we've racialized this, so we have this idea of like these kind of, African people who are not like most of us, who live in the city, and who are therefore kind of living large off the hog of the rest of us or whatever. And it's all a misconception. And what we do when we get angry at these programs, right, is we take money out, and this is not actually an ethical argument here, I'm sorry about this, this is actually appealing to your sympathies. We take money out of the mouths of poor white kids, right? So this is so yeah, social framing matters. So yes, sorry, I went off on a tangent on that. The other question is, how does the moral evolution shape our virtues? Is that it? So there's a character in Dickens's novel, it's not Dombey and Son, is Mrs. Jellybelly? Jellyby, Mrs. Jellyby? Not Jellybelly. What, is it Bleak House? She cares very much for people far away from her, but she has no time at all for people nearby. And in a way, you can effectively turn your moral gaze into a telescopic gaze, which means that you're unable to actually take the telescope out of your eye and look at the people nearby you. So there are lots of people who have this pathology in all sorts of ways, right? Any major politician in the world does good or ill, probably a lot of both, for the people of the world at a much larger rate than they do for their own family. And that's always a kind of grim thought, right? And pray never to be actually yourselves in the position of any political authority, because the possibility of having an ordinary family life is pretty low, I think. So, when your kids are off in college, then you can be president. But, I mean, I see, these, and, the Obamas are doing this very well, but I just think that it's gruesome, these people who have these kind of totally consuming jobs. And I think that's a larger allegory for the tension that the moral revolution puts at us, that it's easy to elbow aside those closest to us and focus on more distant objects of our moral concern, which after all are much less likely to ask anything real of us apart from a donation and a post on Facebook. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you all for enduring an hour and 45 minutes. That's painful. Sorry.
Thank you all for coming.
Yeah. Oh.